In a quiet, forgotten village, a secret lay buried beneath the ground, a tale whispered only in hushed voices of a girl who vanished one moonlit night. Two men of faith, trusted by all, revealed their true faces as they pulled her into the shadows of their church. But what they didn't anticipate was that this girl, desperate and outnumbered, would find strength in the words she had carried in her heart all her life. When she began to speak those sacred verses, the walls shook, the flames flickered, and the power they thought they held slipped through their fingers. This isn't just a story of survival, it's a story of light pushing back against the darkness. In a quiet, remote village in New York, the population was predominantly Christian and Jewish. Muslims were a tiny minority in this community, scattered across a few households. The village seemed peaceful on the surface, but an eerie secret lurked beneath. Every year, as the new year approached, something inexplicable would occur. On the night of the full moon, young Muslim girls would vanish without a trace. No one could explain where they went, who took them, or what fate awaited them. The Muslim families, stricken with fear and grief, began to abandon the village one by one. Those who remained could only speculate, their hearts heavy with sorrow and unease. Eventually, only a single Muslim household remained, a humble home where a devout and impoverished father lived with his 18-year-old daughter. She was a Hafiz Quran, known for her piety and modesty. The father worked tirelessly every day, shielding his daughter from the growing shadows of the village's dark legend. But this year's New Year would bring a challenge greater than he could ever imagine. As the full moon bathed the village in pale light, the rest of the community celebrated joyfully. Church bells rang out, fireworks exploded in the sky, and cheerful laughter echoed in the streets. But in the lone Muslim home, an uneasy silence hung in the air. The father sat on his worn prayer mat, worried for his daughter's safety, silently praying that their home would not fall victim to the yearly horror. Meanwhile, two figures emerged from the shadows. These men were familiar faces, two priests who had long served at the local church. However, their intentions were far from holy. Quietly, under the cover of darkness, they approached the modest house. Without a sound, they entered, their faces cold and expressionless. The girl woke suddenly, startled by a noise, but before she could react, everything went black. The two men had subdued her and carried her off into the night. At dawn, when the father found his daughter gone, a cry tore from his throat. His voice carried through the village, but his pleas were met with indifference. Some villagers scoffed at him, hurling accusations and cruel taunts. The pain of his daughter's disappearance, compounded by the community's callousness, weighed on him like a crushing burden. It was another new year, and the old father sat by the window, anxiously watching the full moon rise. In his heart, he harbored an unspeakable dread. This was the same time of year when Muslim girls had vanished before. Now, he was the only Muslim left in the village, alone except for his daughter. His wife had passed away years ago, and all the other Muslim families had abandoned the area, leaving him behind to protect his only child, an 18-year-old Hafiz Quran. As midnight drew closer, he became more restless. Who could be behind these disappearances? He wondered aloud. His hands trembled as he locked the door, reinforcing it with whatever furniture he could find. His daughter, unaware of the turmoil in his heart, prepared to rest, trusting that her father would keep her safe. But then the unthinkable happened. The girl was gone. When the father awoke and found her missing, his cries echoed through the silent streets. Desperately, he knocked on the doors of the villagers, pleading for their help. "Please, someone tell me, where is my daughter? Who has taken her?" Instead of sympathy, the villagers turned their backs. They murmured cruel accusations, saying, "She must have run off with some lover. A beautiful girl like that wouldn't stay with an old, poor man forever." Their words cut him deeper than any knife, yet he refused to believe it. My daughter is a Hafiz-i-Quran, he insisted, a pure soul. She would never leave on her own. But the more he begged for assistance, the more the villagers mocked him. Their taunts echoed in his ears as he fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face, completely shattered by the loss of his beloved child. When she opened her eyes, the world around her was unrecognizable. The air was thick with a putrid smell, and the dim light revealed a scene straight out of a nightmare. She was no longer in her home. Instead, she found herself in a damp, windowless basement. The walls were bare and cold, and strange, unidentifiable objects were scattered across the floor. In the center of the room stood a grotesque statue, its twisted features illuminated by a flickering candle. The sight alone made her shudder. She realized her hands were bound tightly with coarse ropes. Her head throbbed as she pieced together the fragments of memory, the silent intruders, the muffled struggle, and then nothing. Panic welled up inside her, and she began to tug at the restraints, the ropes cutting into her skin. She screamed for help, her voice echoing off the stone walls, but no answer came. She was utterly alone in this nightmarish place. A sense of dread settled over her as she noticed scattered bones in the corner, human skulls, long since stripped of flesh. The room reeked of decay, a mixture of earth, mold, and something far worse. Her heart raced as the horrifying reality began to sink in. Whoever had brought her here intended something truly evil. She tried to calm herself, taking deep, steady breaths despite the stench and fear. "I must get out of here," she whispered to herself. Yet no doors were visible, only a single opening in the ceiling, far above her head. The hopelessness of her situation gripped her, and she began to pray silently. As fear turned into determination, she resolved to survive no matter what horrors awaited her. The sound of footsteps echoed in the dimly lit basement, drawing her attention. She froze as two men descended the narrow steps. Their faces came into view, familiar faces. They were priests from the village church. Seeing them here in this grim and vile place made her stomach churn. She had once thought of them as men of faith, but the look in their eyes was anything but holy. The taller of the two carried a candle, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The other held a leather-bound book that looked as ancient as the stone around them. As they approached her, she could feel their piercing gazes. There was no kindness in their expressions, only something dark, something sinister. One of the men spoke first, his voice cold and deliberate. "You're here for a reason," he said. "Your blood will serve a higher purpose. The sacrifice must be made to bring forth what we seek." Her body stiffened. "Why?" she cried. "Why are you doing this?" The second priest gave a chilling smile. "Because your kind must be purged," he said. "With each new generation, you spread further. But by stopping you, by offering you up, we halt that growth." The girl's breath quickened. "This isn't right," she stammered. "You're men of God. How can you justify this?" The taller priest leaned closer, his expression dark. "In our eyes, this is divine justice. You're just too blind to see it." Panic surged through her veins, but she knew she had to stay strong. Her mind raced, searching for a way out as the two men began to prepare for their grim ritual. They saw her as an offering, but she vowed she would not be so easily broken. The basement, already a place of dread, grew more suffocating as the hours dragged on. The two priests, consumed by their dark intent, began to torment her with a cruel methodicalness that left no room for hope. They didn't just intend to sacrifice her. They wanted to break her spirit, to shatter every last piece of her will before the end. She was bound so tightly that her wrists were raw, blood trickling from the constant friction of the ropes. They denied her food, mocking her hunger by placing scraps of rancid meat before her. Food not fit for any human, let alone someone as devout as her. The stench in the room grew unbearable, but their words were worse. They hurled insults at her faith, at her identity, each word cutting deeper than the ropes could. "What kind of god would abandon you here?" one of them sneered, pacing around her like a predator playing with its prey. "Where are your prayers now, little girl?" Her lips trembled, but she didn't respond. She kept her thoughts inward, repeating verses she had memorized since childhood. No matter how many times they tried to humiliate her, she refused to let their words settle in her heart. She held on to the belief that this trial, no matter how horrific, would end. They struck her occasionally, not hard enough to kill, but enough to ensure she felt every blow. Her body ached, her mind screamed for rest, yet she clung to the only hope she had, her faith. One night, as she drifted into a fragile sleep, she dreamt of light. A bird, pure and radiant, perched on her shoulder and whispered words she knew by heart, Ayat al-Kursi. In her dream, as the bird sang the verse, her wounds began to heal and her body felt lighter. The comfort of that moment stayed with her, even as she woke to the bleak reality of her prison. The priests returned, dragging her to a makeshift altar. They whispered their chants, gloating at her frailty. But inside she was stronger than ever. She closed her eyes and began to recite the verse she had heard in her dream, softly at first, then louder as their chanting tried to drown her out. She refused to let them break her spirit, drawing strength from the words that connected her to something far greater than the darkness that surrounded her. As the flickering flames cast eerie shadows against the cold stone walls, she woke to the sound of guttural chants echoing through the basement. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she saw the two priests seated by the fire. Their voices were low and unsettling, reciting words she couldn't understand but that filled the room with a dreadful heaviness. They barely acknowledged her now, intent on their grim ritual. She sat silently at first, her heart racing, her mind swirling. They were planning something terrible. This much she knew. The girl felt an overwhelming sense of urgency to act, to resist in any way she could. She thought back to the dream that had stayed with her, the glowing bird and the verse she had learned as a child. Slowly, she began to recite Ayat al-Kursi under her breath. The first words felt like a small flicker of light in a sea of darkness. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied as she repeated the verse. The priests glanced over at her, annoyance flashing across their faces. One of them barked, "Be silent!" But she didn't stop. The words were her shield, her strength, her only hope. One of the men rose and slapped her hard across the face. "Enough of your nonsense," he growled. "Do you think your muttering will change anything?" Her cheek stung, but her resolve didn't waver. Instead, she raised her voice, the sacred verse pouring out with more conviction. The flames flickered, the air around them seemed to shift, and suddenly the priests faltered. The one standing stumbled back as though struck by an invisible force. The other scrambled to his feet, shouting at his companion, their calm demeanor unraveling into panic. The girl continued, her voice unwavering now, her heart strong with faith. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier, not with their chants, but with her words. She believed, truly believed, that no evil could stand against the power of the verse. The men were shouting now, their voices cracking, their steps unsteady, as if the ground beneath them was no longer solid. She didn't stop, couldn't stop. This was her defense, her weapon, and she knew, without doubt, that the truth and power of those words would protect her from the evil surrounding her. As the girl's voice rose above the priest's incantations, the room seemed to shift. The flames in their makeshift altar flickered violently, casting strange, twisting shadows on the cold walls. The two men exchanged worried glances, their confidence replaced by a growing unease. Still, they tried to continue their dark ritual, their chants growing louder and more desperate, as though they were fighting against something unseen. But the girl didn't falter. Her recitation of Ayat al-Kursi grew louder, steadier, and with every word the oppressive atmosphere in the room seemed to turn against them. Suddenly the flames flared uncontrollably, leaping upward as if they had a life of their own. The air grew thick, and a deep, low rumble echoed through the basement. The priests cried out, their voices panicked now. One clutched his chest, stumbling backward, while the other reached for the altar, only to pull his hand away as if burned. Their once calm, authoritative expressions twisted into sheer terror. The ritual they had tried to perform was no longer under their control. Without warning, a force seemed to lift them from the ground. Their feet left the floor, and their bodies were hurled against the walls. They screamed as though some invisible hand had grabbed them, and their voices filled the room, a chilling symphony of fear and confusion. Blood trickled from their noses and mouths as they struggled in vain to regain control. The girl continued to recite, her faith unshaken, her voice unwavering. She knew that she was witnessing the power of the words she had learned as a child, the power of the verse that offered divine protection. And as the priests writhed in agony, the flames began to die down, leaving only silence and the faint, steady echo of her prayers. The chaos in the basement reverberated beyond its confines. The villagers, once asleep or distracted by their nightly routines, were drawn to the distant sounds of screaming and crashing. Confused murmurs spread through the streets as neighbors peeked out from their homes. Someone suggested the noise was coming from the old church, but no one could say for certain. A few brave souls, armed with flashlights and shovels, ventured out to investigate. As they approached the church, the source of the uproar grew clearer. The cries of the priests echoed eerily in the air, distinct and unfamiliar. Even those who had known these men for years were unsettled by the uncharacteristic terror in their voices. A small group gathered at the church's back entrance, where the sound seemed strongest. It was there that they found the hidden hatch to the basement, an old, weathered door half buried in the ground. With every shove and heave, the villagers fought against rusted hinges and swollen wood until the door finally gave way. A stench of decay and smoke wafted out, causing several of them to gag. But they pressed on, climbing down into the darkened basement. What they found shocked them beyond words. In the faint light of their torches, the girl was huddled against a wall, her wrists still bound, her face pale, but her spirit unbroken. The villagers rushed to her aid, freeing her from the ropes and helping her to her feet. They then turned their attention to the two priests, who lay crumpled on the ground, groaning and visibly injured. The villagers looked around in disbelief at the gruesome remnants of the scene. Many had dismissed the girl's father's pleas earlier, but now, confronted with the evidence of the priest's sinister actions, they realized the truth. As the villagers stood in the dim, stifling basement, their astonishment only deepened. Among the twisted remnants of the priest's failed ritual lay another revelation, an opening in the far corner of the room that led to a hidden tunnel. The narrow passage was crudely dug, with uneven walls and wooden supports that creaked ominously. A few brave villagers peered into the darkness, their flashlight beams revealing a path that extended far beyond the confines of the church. No one had ever known of this tunnel's existence, not even the church's senior leaders. The discovery was baffling and disturbing. It raised countless questions. How long had it been there? Who built it, and for what purpose? Most importantly, was this passage connected to the disappearances of the other girls over the years? The older priest, now regaining some of his senses, was pressed for answers. But all he could offer were cryptic, disjointed explanations. He confessed that the tunnel was part of a clandestine network used by a shadowy organization whose motives were shrouded in secrecy. The group's goal, he claimed, had been to carry out rituals and sacrifices in total isolation. For years, they had lured victims into the church's basement, confident that their dark deeds would never come to light. The villagers were horrified. The church they had always trusted as a sanctuary of faith and peace was now revealed to have harbored a terrible secret beneath its foundations. It wasn't just the priests who were complicit, but the very structure itself, a place meant to protect and guide them, had been corrupted. This newfound knowledge left the villagers reeling. They realized they were not only witnesses to a monstrous crime, but also the ones who would have to uncover the full extent of the horrors hidden in that tunnel. In the days following the shocking revelation, the village was still grappling with what had transpired. The church priest, who had always been a figure of moral guidance, found himself consumed by guilt and disbelief. He had never suspected that those under his charge could be involved in such atrocities. Racked with shame, he called an emergency gathering inside the church. All the remaining villagers, including the girl's devastated father, gathered in the pews. The atmosphere was heavy with anger and sorrow. The priest stood before them, his hands trembling, his voice laden with regret. "I have failed you," he began. "I trusted these men without question, and in doing so I allowed evil to thrive under this very roof." He turned to the girl's father, lowering his head. "Please forgive me. My negligence brought harm to your family and to our entire community. I take full responsibility for what has happened." The girl's father, still shaken but holding his daughter's hand, said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. The priest then declared that the church's dark history would not be buried. He vowed to report every detail to the authorities and ensure that the guilty men faced the full weight of justice. When the police arrived, they arrested the two injured priests and began an in-depth investigation into the hidden tunnel and its grim purpose. The priest also requested that an independent oversight committee be established to prevent anything like this from happening again. He personally oversaw the removal of the grotesque statues, the sealing of the basement, and the replacement of church leadership with individuals of proven integrity. Over time, the community began to heal. The priest's sincere efforts to seek forgiveness and make amends helped restore trust. The once fractured village slowly came together, united by the painful lesson that vigilance and accountability are vital to ensuring that evil does not take root, even in places once thought sacred.